Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are wading directly into a highly charged debate. It's gripping mental health professionals, educators, parents, pretty much everyone.
It really is.
We're going deep on the public discourse and the professional critique around Abigail Shrier's lightning rod of a book, Bad Therapy: Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up.
A book that has made a lot of waves.
Absolutely. So our mission for this deep dive is simple, but I think pretty crucial. Shrier's book goes after modern therapy, certain parenting trends, and this is a big one-school-based mental health programs like social emotional learning, or SEL. The public debate is just.
Yeah.
It's incredibly loud, often very political, so we want to filter through that noise, find the substantiated criticisms, and really look at where practicing clinicians have stepped in to fact-check her claims.
Right.
The goal here is to walk away understanding the legitimate professional concerns. Is there a risk of over-pathologizing normal childhood distress? Are we turning resilience into just a footnote?
And that's a key frame for this whole conversation. The book, from the very start, it's really tailored toward an audience that's already deeply skeptical of all this mental health terminology being directed at kids.
It has a built-in audience.
It does. And Shrier uses a lot of ink to cast therapists and teachers as these condescending, intrusive elites.
Yeah.
The idea is that they see parents as just ignorant obstacles.
Yeah.
It's a really effective way to rally a specific base of readers.
Okay, so let's unpack that, because when you look at how professionals have responded, it seems to take a minute for the book's real target to come into focus.
Yeah.
What is she truly focusing on? It can't just be a generalized swipe at the entire therapeutic field.
No, it's not. While the cover and a lot of the initial hype suggest she's targeting all therapists, all schools, the sources we looked at suggest the book's real focus is much narrower.
Which is
It's a specific style of parenting, what many of her critics have called a caricature of anxious and intrusive upper-middle-class parenting. She spends a lot of time mocking this specific parental approach. Parents who rush to get a professional diagnosis for every little bit of childhood distress.
the idea being that the label becomes the focus.
Exactly. The core critique is that these parents prefer that diagnostic label. It makes the problem feel fixed, professionalized, rather than just letting their child suffer a little bit. Experience normal hardship or disappointment that they should learning to work through on their own.
And she's very specific about where this happens, right? I remember reading about her mocking examples of kids gently raised in Brentwood and Park Slope and Lincoln Park.
Oh, absolutely. That is highly targeted rhetoric.
It feels very deliberate.
It is. She's using these places, affluent, generally liberal areas, to stereotype a model of anxious helicopter parenting that she argues is just fundamentally destructive to a child's resilience. It really hammers home that this is less a clinical critique and more of a culture critique that's just packaged as one.
So it's aimed at a very specific political and parental readership.
Right. The book really reads like it's preaching to the choir. It feels like a call to rally parental rights activists to go beyond things like library books and start attacking school counselors and mental health staff directly.
And her own background plays into that perception.
It does. It's important context. Shrier is a lawyer and a columnist. She is not a mental health clinician or a trained journalist, which many critics argue, it limits her ability to really understand the research she's citing. It leads her to cherry-pick data that fits her narrative.
Okay, that's a powerful cultural argument she's making. But, and this is where it gets really important for our listeners, even the professionals who are deeply critical of her methods or tone, they still admit she hits on some legitimate concerns.
Yes, she does. The book isn't dismissed out of hand.
So what are those key points? Where is she actually on solid ground, according to therapists and researchers?
Well, there are several, and there are things that have been part of the field's own internal conversation for years. This is where the book, forces a necessary public discussion.
Okay, like what?
The first major point is on preventive care. Despite huge investments and, the best of intentions, Shrier is right that preventive mental health care isn't really a thing, not in the way that's proven consistently effective, especially when you apply it broadly across a whole school.
The evidence just isn't there.
The evidence for long-term benefits is extremely thin, and the costs are massive. And that lack of consistent results makes a lot of professionals question these mass implementation programs.
And if that preventive approach isn't working, does it risk causing harm? Just by introducing the idea of pathology where it might not have existed.
Exactly. Which brings us to the second very related point, the risk of rumination. Shrier is right that going to therapy when you don't have debilitating symptoms can cause relatively well-functioning people, kids included, to just ruminate.
To overthink everything.
Yes, to fixate on minor negative things or emotional stressors. The therapy itself can force a focus on problems that might have just resolved on their own. It can turn normal self-doubt into a kind of obsessive anxiety.
Okay, and what's the third point? I heard it was a big one.
It is, and it's maybe the one that resonates most with professionals. It's that therapy isn't just sometimes ineffective. It can be actively harmful. In a minority of cases, clients can leave worse off than when they started.
And there's data on this.
There is. She correctly points to well-established, replicated research that finds negative effects, what are sometimes called iatrogenic effects, meaning caused by the treatment, in about 10% of cases.
10%, that's a significant number, and it's not something she just made up. It's from consensus science.
It is, and it's a real, measured risk that the field needs to own.
Yeah.
She also raises valid questions about trauma intervention. Her point that some people dealing with severe trauma are actually better served by not talking about it. That's clinically sound.
Forcing it can make things worse.
It can be very destabilizing. And finally, she highlights a sensitive internal issue. Therapists can sometimes inadvertently nudge clients toward decisions that aren't in their best interest, like cutting off family relationships in the name of boundaries. It points to a real power imbalance.
You mentioned trauma. I know she draws this line from the recovered memory craze of the past to the current focus on implicit memory. Can you expand on that?
Yes, and this is maybe her most powerful historical argument. She explicitly connects the now discredited idea of recovered memories to the widely accepted, but still scientifically questionable, idea that trauma lives in implicit memory.
This is the idea of body memory, championed by people like Bessel van der Kolk.
Exactly. And Shrier correctly points out that van der Kolk championed both of those ideas at different points in time. For professionals who lived through the fallout of the recovered memory scandals, where people were falsely accused of abuse, that parallel is really unsettling.
Because it suggests a pattern.
It highlights how the field can fall victim to harmful trends, accepting a model as truth before the evidence is really there. This history of getting ahead of the science creates genuine professional self-doubt, and Shrier taps into that very effectively.
That's a strong case for caution. But let's shift gears. A lot of the professional critique isn't about if her points are valid, but how she supports them. So if she had these solid points, where did her sourcing and rhetoric fall apart? Where did the fact-checkers come in?
She repeatedly weakens her own arguments by using weaker data when stronger consensus data was already available. It's a strange choice.
For instance?
For instance, on the negative impacts of therapy. We just talked about that widely accepted 10% rate from multiple studies.
Right.
Instead of using that, Shrier sets a number higher than 10%, but it's based on a single, isolated study of one specific type of treatment. The stronger science already supported her general concern, but she chose the weaker data point, and critics just seize on that.
So she overstates her case when she doesn't need to. What about on the policy side? I know she goes after restorative justice in schools.
She does, and this is a huge example. She makes this sweeping claim that schools that adopted restorative justice, or RJ, fell apart and descended into chaos.
That's a very strong claim. Total policy failure. What did the actual data she cited? The RAND study, what did it say?
The RAND study showed what you usually see in these kinds of implementation studies. Mixed results. It was messy.
How so?
Well, on one hand, suspension rates and racial disparities in discipline decreased a lot, which is a key goal of RJ. But on the other hand, arrests increased and academic outcomes got worse in middle school, though they were unchanged in high school.
So the schools definitely didn't crumble.
No. There were clear struggles, significant problems, but it wasn't the black and white policy failure she paints it as. She misrepresented the nuanced reality.
Wait, but if arrests went up, doesn't that still suggest the schools were struggling to manage conflict? I mean, even if they didn't fall apart?
Absolutely. It suggests very real implementation challenges. The critique isn't that RJ is perfect or that there weren't problems. The critique is that Shrier framed a complex, partially negative outcome as a wholesale catastrophe.
And this happens again, right? With a type of trauma therapy.
It does, yeah. She criticizes the field for using something called critical incident stress debriefing, or CISD. This was a popular practice years ago where, after a critical event like a disaster, people were sort of forced into an immediate group debriefing.
And she's right that it was a bad practice.
She is. Studies did show this treatment was often more likely to hurt than help.
So what's the misrepresentation there?
The misrepresentation is that she fails to mention that CISD isn't really done today. And the reason it isn't done is precisely because of those debunking studies. The professional community saw the evidence and discarded the practice.
Ah, so she's criticizing current therapists for a past practice that the profession itself corrected through scientific review.
Exactly.
That feels fundamentally disingenuous. It's like criticizing modern surgeons for practicing bloodletting.
It's attacking a solved problem. It makes her critique of the current landscape feel misplaced. And finally, let's look at social-emotional learning, SEL. This is a huge target for her.
Right. She argues it creates the wrong orientation in kids.
Yeah, she argues it promotes a harmful state orientation. This focus on internal feelings, struggles, frustrations, over what she says is a necessary task orientation. Focusing on schoolwork, problem-solving, action.
So focusing on emotion always detracts from academic work, in her view.
Essentially, yes. She believes it turns the child's focus too far inward and creates self-obsession instead of resilience. And, it's an interesting philosophical point, but she doesn't produce evidence to support the claim that SEL specifically causes this harm.
And is there counter-evidence?
There is, and it's quite robust. A government-funded report that looked at hundreds of studies concluded that well-implemented SEL programs actually reduce conduct problems, decrease emotional distress, and even measurably improve average achievement test scores. She makes an argument that resonates, but she relies on opinion over the actual evidence.
So, bringing this all together, beyond the book's specific points, what deeper professional discussions has this whole debate sparked? What are the challenges therapists are facing that this brings to light?
Well, it really forces clinicians to talk publicly about concerns they usually only discuss behind closed doors. And probably the most frequent observation you hear is about the true source of the distress.
Which is what?
That many kids are put into therapy who don't actually need it. Their parents do.
Wow.
Clinicians say they frequently see kids with normal developmental struggles, but the parents have pathologized it because they are too anxious to tolerate their child's normal distress. We see it acutely in the 18 to 20-year-old population, young adults trying to undo the damage of over-involved parents. You hear it all the time. The kid is totally fine. Their parents are a mess.
It's a burden shift. The child gets labeled as the problem to manage the parental anxiety.
Precisely. And there's another observation, too, that young people, often influenced by social media, are getting kind of romanced by the idea of being unwell.
Where a diagnosis becomes an identity.
Yes, an aesthetic or a community identifier. And that can lead to treatment dependency, and it confuses normal self-exploration with clinical pathology. They embrace a victim identity instead of exploring growth.
And what about the practical reality for therapists? Does this book touch on the pressures inside the field itself?
It does, and it's a necessary self-critique. Some therapists feel they spend a disproportionate amount of time with clients who are relatively stable, committed to growth. Basically, people who are better suited for short-term coaching.
Because they're easier clients.
They're easier clients. They're motivated, less volatile. Meanwhile, the really difficult or unstable clients, the ones who need complex long-term care, they often get referred out because they're just too challenging to manage under the current insurance and system constraints.
Which creates a strange dynamic.
It creates a huge dilemma. The easier clients, who might just need coaching, are at risk of becoming treatment-dependent and overly self-obsessed, which, ironically, is exactly the problem Shrier identifies. It's a structural flaw in how we deliver mental health care that incentivizes treating the well-adjusted.
It's just a shame that the book's valid insights get undermined.
They do. They get undercut by these sweeping, unsupported opinions. Things like saying mental health care is remarkably underregulated or that most child therapists ought to be fired on the spot.
Yeah.
Those statements just undermine the legitimate, evidence-backed critique she sometimes manages to land.
That feels like the core takeaway for you, the listener. The book is a necessary, if very flawed, counterpoint to some trends in the field. It forces a useful discussion about the risks of therapy, overdiagnosis, and the real meaning of resilience. It forces professionals to re-examine the structural issues that lead to overtreatment. But its effectiveness is so limited by the exaggerated claims and the specific political framing, it makes it hard to recommend without some very heavy caveats.
And we have to circle back to the author's own disclaimer. She puts it in there to try and insulate the book from criticism, saying it only applies to kids who do not have significant debilitating mental health needs.
Which is a huge carve-out.
It is. And it raises, I think, an important and provocative question for you to mull over after this deep dive.
Go on.
In a culture that increasingly seems to be labeling every kind of normal childhood distress as a pathology.
Yeah.
How do you draw the line?
Not a clinical line, but...
No, philosophical one. Between a necessary diagnosis for real debilitating suffering and the kind of uncomfortable suffering a child just needs to work through on their own to build genuine, durable resilience.